For years, women vanished from the streets of Baltimore, and no one connected the dots, until whispers about a giant man, a refrigerated truck, and meat sold to the public began to surface, revealing how Joe Metheny lived in plain sight, killing, consuming, and disappearing human lives while the city looked the other way. Thank you for being here for this important and difficult story. These moments aren't easy to hear, but understanding them helps us honor the voices that were lost and stay aware of the world around us. If this series adds value, please like and subscribe. It truly helps the channel grow. Now let's begin. Chapter 1. A monster hidden in plain sight. Baltimore, Maryland, is a city layered with contradictions. By day, its streets hum with routine life. Cars inching through traffic, corner stores opening their metal shutters, the distant echo of sirens blending into the background like a familiar song. By night, shadows stretch longer, and stories linger in the air, whispered rather than spoken aloud. It was within this ordinary, struggling, very human city that one of America's most disturbing predators lived for years without drawing serious attention. His name was Joe Metheny, and for a long time, he was not a headline, not a warning, not even a rumor that anyone took seriously. Joe Metheny was not clever in the way popular culture often portrays serial killers. He did not live behind carefully constructed masks or cultivate charm to manipulate those around him. Instead, he was loud, crude, intimidating, and physically imposing. He stood over 6 feet tall and weighed more than 400 pounds at his heaviest, his presence dominating any room he entered. He drank heavily, cursed freely, and carried himself with the reckless confidence of someone who believed the world had already written him off. In many ways, that belief was correct. Metheny lived on the fringes of society, in places where people learned not to ask too many questions. Construction sites, abandoned lots, and drug-infested neighborhoods became his regular environment. These were spaces where survival mattered more than curiosity, where missing people were rarely reported quickly, and where violence blended seamlessly into everyday life. It was here, among the forgotten and the overlooked, that Metheny found both anonymity and opportunity to understand how Joe Metheny remained invisible for so long. It's important to understand the environment around him. Baltimore in the 1990s was struggling under the weight of crime, addiction, and systemic neglect. Entire neighborhoods were marked by poverty and decay. Sex workers, homeless individuals, and drug users moved through the city largely unseen by institutions meant to protect them. When someone from these communities disappeared, their absence often went unnoticed or was quietly accepted as another tragic but unsurprising outcome of life on the streets. Metheny knew this. He understood it instinctively. He didn't need to study criminology or psychology to recognize which lives were considered disposable. His victims were not random in the way the public often imagines serial murder. They were carefully chosen based on vulnerability, isolation, and the likelihood that no one would immediately come looking in public. Joe Metheny was crude but unremarkable. He worked temporary jobs, drifted in and out of employment, and spent much of his time drinking in bars or loitering near areas known for prostitution. People remembered him as unpleasant, sometimes threatening, but not necessarily dangerous. He blended into a city already overwhelmed with worse problems. A man like Joe Metheny did not stand out in police reports filled with shootings, robberies, and overdoses. Yet beneath this surface-level banality was something far darker. Metheny carried an intense, simmering rage that shaped how he saw the world. He believed he had been wronged repeatedly by women, by authority figures, by society as a whole. This resentment was not quiet or reflective. It was explosive and deeply personal. In his mind, He was not responsible for his failures. The world had conspired against him, and he felt justified in striking back that night. As the city settled into uneasy silence, Metheny's routines took on a more sinister shape. He would drive slowly through certain areas, watching, waiting, observing patterns that others ignored. His size made him appear dominant, even protective to some. To others, especially women accustomed to danger, he was just another threat in a long line of them. But desperation has a way of blurring instinct, and Metheny relied on that blur. What made Joe Metheny particularly disturbing was not only what he did, but how casually he later spoke about it. He did not describe elaborate fantasies or ritualistic planning. His crimes were driven by anger, opportunity, and a complete lack of empathy. Violence, to him, was not extraordinary. It was an extension of his emotional state, a release for feelings he neither controlled nor questioned. At the time, no one connected the dots. Missing persons reports, when they existed at all, were scattered and incomplete. Bodies were rarely found, and when remains did surface, they were often too degraded to immediately identify. Baltimore's law enforcement agencies were stretched thin, prioritizing crimes that generated public pressure and media attention. Joe Metheny operated below that threshold, in the blind spots of a system already overwhelmed. There were moments when his behavior raised concern. His temper was unpredictable. He threatened people openly. He spoke with unsettling familiarity about violence. But in a city where such behavior was not uncommon, these warning signs failed to trigger meaningful intervention. Metheny was seen as a problem, not a predator. This is how monsters survive in plain sight, not through brilliance, but through neglect. They rely on chaos, indifference, and the assumption that the worst could never be hiding behind something so ordinary. Joe Metheny did not need to hide who he was. He simply needed the world to look the other way. And for years, it did be why the time authorities began to understand the scale of what had been happening. The damage was already done. Lives had been erased, families left with unanswered questions, and a city forced to confront the reality that one of its most dangerous killers had walked its streets openly, unnoticed and unchallenged. This is where the story begins, not with his crimes fully revealed, but with the silence that allowed them to happen. The silence that surrounded Joe Metheny was not accidental. It was built slowly, brick by brick, through years of overlooked warnings and normalized danger. In Baltimore's most neglected corners, survival required emotional distance. People learned to mind their own business, to keep moving, to not stare too long or ask too many questions. In that environment, Metheny's presence became just another unsettling detail in a city already filled with them. He was known locally as someone to avoid. His size alone made him memorable, but not in a way that triggered alarm. He argued loudly in bars, drank until his words slurred into threats, and carried an air of hostility that kept people at arm's length. Yet there was nothing about him that screamed serial killer to those who crossed his path. He was simply another angry man spiraling through addiction and instability, something Baltimore had seen countless times before. What allowed Metheny to remain hidden was not clever deception, but predictability. He lived openly within a routine that made sense to outsiders. He worked sporadically in construction, took temporary jobs that required little background checking, and spent long hours in areas already associated with crime. When he disappeared for days or weeks, no one questioned it. When he reappeared, no one asked where he had been. There were rumors, of course. Whispers drifted through the streets, fragments of unease exchanged between people who sensed something was wrong but lacked the power to act on it. Some women remembered encounters that felt off, moments where Metheny's tone shifted unexpectedly, or his eyes lingered too long. Others recalled crude jokes that crossed into something darker. But these stories rarely traveled far. Fear has a way of silencing its own witnesses. Law enforcement, stretched thin and overwhelmed, relied heavily on patterns and statistics. Crimes that did not fit a clear trajectory were often sidelined. Missing persons cases involving sex workers or homeless individuals were notoriously difficult to pursue. Many victims had little documented history, unstable housing, or strained family relationships. Without immediate evidence of foul play, cases stalled quickly. Metheny understood this reality intuitively. He did not need to outsmart investigators. He only needed to exist where investigators rarely looked. His life unfolded in places where people disappeared all the time. Addiction, violence, and transience blurred the lines between voluntary absence and something far more sinister. As the months passed, his confidence grew. There is a dangerous shift that occurs when someone commits acts of extreme violence and faces no consequences. The absence of accountability begins to feel like validation. For Metheny, this likely reinforced his belief that he was untouchable. The city had already decided whose lives mattered, and his actions simply followed that unspoken hierarchy. At the same time, Metheny's internal world grew darker. His anger, already volatile, became more entrenched. He spoke increasingly about betrayal, about being wronged by women, about a society that he believed had cheated him at every turn. These weren't quiet grievances. They spilled out during drunken rants, sometimes accompanied by threats that were brushed off as meaningless bravado. Those closest to him, acquaintances rather than friends, learned to tolerate his presence without engaging deeply. Metheny was not someone people wanted to know well. Emotional distance became a form of self-protection. In hindsight, this detachment was one of the reasons no one noticed the warning signs piling up. Even as bodies began to accumulate, there was no immediate sense of a serial offender at work. The crimes were scattered, the victims disconnected in the eyes of the system. Without a clear pattern, investigators struggled to link cases together. The city's attention remained focused elsewhere, on crimes that were louder, bloodier, and more visible. What makes this period especially haunting is how ordinary it all seemed. Metheny walked the same streets, drank in the same bars, and exchanged words with the same people week after week. He was not hiding in the shadows. He was standing under streetlights. The monster did not lurk in darkness. He existed in plain sight, protected by indifference and exhaustion. This is the uncomfortable truth at the heart of Joe Metheny's story. His crimes were not enabled by brilliance or secrecy, but by a collective failure to see certain lives as worth urgent protection. The system did not collapse overnight. It eroded slowly, leaving gaps wide enough for someone like Metheny to operate freely. As time moved forward, the silence grew heavier. Each unanswered disappearance added to a quiet ledger of loss, one that no single agency fully acknowledged. Families waited without closure. Streets absorbed their grief and carried on. And Metheny, emboldened by years of invisibility, continued down a path that would only grow more violent. This chapter of the story ends not with an arrest or a revelation, but with a chilling understanding. The most dangerous predators are not always the ones hiding in darkness. Sometimes, they are the ones everyone learns to ignore. Chapter 2. A childhood shaped by violence and loss. Joe Metheny's story does not begin with murder. It begins much earlier, in a childhood marked by instability, neglect, and an early introduction to violence that would quietly shape the man he became. Like many narratives of extreme criminal behavior, the roots are tangled in years that passed largely unnoticed, years where damage accumulated slowly, without intervention, without relief. Born into a working-class family, Joe Metheny grew up in an environment where emotional security was scarce. His household was not one defined by warmth or consistency. Authority came harshly, and affection, when it existed at all, was unreliable. As a child, Metheny learned early that the world was not a safe place, and that vulnerability was something to be punished rather than protected. Accounts of his early life describe a boy who struggled to fit in, both at home and in school. He was large even as a child, physically awkward, and often singled out for ridicule. Instead of support, he encountered hostility. Instead of guidance, he found himself navigating anger and confusion alone. These experiences did not simply hurt him in passing, they hardened him. Violence was not an abstract concept in Metheny's youth. It was something he witnessed, absorbed, and eventually normalized. Arguments escalated quickly in his home. Discipline blurred into aggression. Over time, the boundary between acceptable behavior and brutality became indistinct. For a developing mind, this environment taught a dangerous lesson. Power came from intimidation, and pain was an effective tool. As Metheny grew older, his emotional responses became increasingly extreme. He was quick to anger and slow to trust. Teachers noticed behavioral issues, but intervention was minimal. This was an era when troubled children were often labeled and dismissed rather than understood. Metheny was seen as a problem, not a child in need of help. School offered little refuge. Social isolation deepened his resentment. He did not form close friendships, and interactions with peers often ended in conflict. Each rejection reinforced a growing sense of being wronged by the world. Over time, this resentment began to define his identity. He was not simply unhappy, he was furious. Alcohol entered his life at a young age, becoming both an escape and an accelerant. Drinking dulled his insecurities while amplifying his aggression. What began as experimentation quickly turned into dependency. Substance abuse became a constant companion, shaping his behavior and eroding whatever emotional regulation he might have developed. One of the most significant losses in Metheny's early life was the death of his father. This event, often cited as a turning point, left a profound emotional vacuum. The grief was never properly processed. Instead, it fermented into bitterness and anger. Metheny did not learn how to mourn, he learned how to blame. Without stable guidance, Metheny drifted. Authority figures came and went, but none stayed long enough to make a lasting impact. Structure was absent, and with it, accountability. As he moved into adolescence and early adulthood, his behavior grew more reckless. Fights became more frequent. Legal troubles began to surface, though they rarely carried lasting consequences. This pattern, destructive behavior followed by minimal accountability, reinforced a dangerous belief system. Metheny learned that he could act out violently and still continue on largely unchanged. Each encounter with the law that ended without serious repercussions strengthened his sense of invincibility. What's important to understand is not that Metheny's childhood caused his crimes, but that it shaped the emotional framework through which he viewed the world. He developed no meaningful empathy for others, no internal brakes to slow his anger. Pain, to him, was a currency he had learned to trade in early. By the time Metheny reached adulthood, the foundation was already set. His worldview was rigid, his emotional responses extreme, and his coping mechanisms destructive. He carried his childhood wounds openly, but instead of seeking healing, he weaponized them. This is the uncomfortable reality of Joe Metheny's early years. They were not uniquely tragic, but they were deeply damaging. They reveal how neglect, violence, and untreated trauma can intersect to produce someone capable of extraordinary harm, not overnight, but gradually, through years of silence and missed opportunities. As Joe Metheny moved further into adolescence, the fractures formed in childhood did not heal, they widened. Without stability, guidance, or emotional grounding, his inner world became increasingly rigid and hostile. He began to see life as a series of confrontations, situations to be endured or dominated. Compassion did not fit into this framework. Survival did. By his teenage years, Metheny's anger was no longer sporadic. It became his default state. Small frustrations triggered outsized reactions, and his physical size gave him a sense of leverage over others. He learned that fear could silence opposition quickly. When people backed away from him, it reinforced the idea that intimidation worked. Over time, this response pattern settled into something automatic. Authority figures struggled to reach him. Teachers, employers, and supervisors described him as volatile and uncooperative. He resisted structure and resented rules, viewing them as attempts to control or humiliate him. Rather than adapting, he withdrew or lashed out. Each failure added another layer to a growing narrative in his mind. The world was against him, and he owed it nothing. His relationship with alcohol deepened during this period. Drinking was not social or celebratory, it was functional. Alcohol numbed emotional discomfort and gave his anger a sense of direction. Under its influence, his inhibitions dropped further and his aggression intensified. Fights became more frequent. His reputation hardened. People learned to keep their distance. Despite these warning signs, meaningful intervention never arrived. Encounters with the legal system were brief and largely ineffective. Minor charges, short detentions, and dismissals followed one another without addressing the underlying issues. Metheny learned that consequences were temporary and survivable. The lesson was not correction, but endurance. As he entered adulthood, Metheny drifted between low-paying jobs and long periods of unemployment. Construction work appealed to him because it required little oversight and rewarded physical strength. It also placed him in transient environments, where people came and went without leaving records. These settings mirrored his internal world, unstable, rough, and unexamined. Emotionally, Metheny remained stunted. He did not form healthy romantic relationships. Interactions with women were often tense, marked by entitlement and resentment. Rejection, whether real or perceived, fueled his rage. He interpreted personal setbacks as deliberate acts of disrespect, deepening his hostility. The loss of his father continued to cast a long shadow. Instead of softening with time, the grief hardened into a fixed grievance. Metheny spoke of betrayal and abandonment, framing himself as someone perpetually denied fairness. This belief insulated him from guilt. In his mind, harm inflicted on others was merely a reflection of harm he had already endured. Psychologically, Metheny displayed traits often associated with chronic aggression: poor impulse control, lack of empathy, and an externalized sense of blame. But these traits were never formally assessed or treated. He passed through systems not designed to look beneath the surface, leaving his inner deterioration unaddressed. What makes this stage of his life especially unsettling is how ordinary it appeared. There were no dramatic interventions, no clear turning points visible to outsiders. Metheny was simply another troubled man navigating adulthood poorly. His struggles did not inspire urgency or alarm. They blended into the background of a society accustomed to dysfunction. Yet beneath that ordinariness, something dangerous was consolidating. His worldview had fully crystallized. Other people were not individuals with inner lives. They were obstacles, irritants, or tools. Pain was no longer something to be avoided. It was something he had learned to distribute. By the time Metheny reached his late 20s and early 30s, The emotional groundwork for extreme violence was firmly in place. The anger was constant, the empathy absent, and the coping mechanisms destructive. What he lacked was not motivation, but opportunity. This chapter of his life closes without resolution because none arrived. There was no intervention that redirected his path, no moment of insight that softened his rage. Instead, Joe Metheny carried his unresolved childhood forward into adulthood, where the consequences would no longer be confined to his own life. They would spill outward into the lives of others, people who never knew his past, never understood his pain, and never saw the danger approaching. Chapter 3: Baltimore's Forgotten Streets. Baltimore did not fail Joe Metheny alone, and Joe Metheny did not operate alone within the city's darkness. The streets that would later absorb his crimes were already shaped by decades of neglect, inequality, and quiet desperation. To understand how his violence could unfold unnoticed, it's necessary to understand the places where it happened, neighborhoods that existed beyond headlines, beyond urgency, and often beyond help. In the parts of Baltimore where Metheny spent most of his time, life moved according to a different rhythm. These were areas marked by abandoned row houses, empty factories, and streets where streetlights flickered more than they shone. Entire blocks bore the signs of long-term economic collapse. Jobs had disappeared years earlier, replaced by informal economies built around survival rather than stability. People who lived here learned to adapt. Trust was limited. Attention was selective. You noticed what kept you alive and ignored what didn't. Violence was not shocking. It was expected. Sirens were background noise. Arguments spilled into the streets and faded without resolution. In this environment, danger didn't announce itself. It blended in. Metheny gravitated naturally toward these spaces. They mirrored his internal world, chaotic, unregulated, and largely invisible to authority. He did not need to search for isolation. It was built into the geography. Empty lots provided privacy. Industrial zones offered cover. Construction sites shifted constantly, erasing traces of who had been there and when. For many residents, daily life was an exercise in endurance. Addiction was common, not as a moral failing but as a coping mechanism. Sex work existed openly in certain areas, driven by poverty, trauma, and lack of alternatives. These were not hidden activities. They were part of the local ecosystem. And because they were so visible, they were also so normalized that individual lives blurred together. This normalization was critical to Metheny's ability to operate. His victims came from populations already accustomed to risk. When someone didn't return, it wasn't immediately alarming. People assumed arrests, overdoses, or voluntary disappearances. The truth, when it existed, took too long to surface. Law enforcement presence in these neighborhoods was inconsistent. Officers responded to emergencies, but long-term investigations were rare. Trust between police and residents was fragile at best. Many people avoided contact with authorities altogether, fearing consequences that outweighed potential help. Silence became a form of self-protection. Metheny exploited this silence without ever articulating it. He didn't speak about strategy or planning. He simply moved where the system was weakest. He learned which areas were least monitored, which times were least active, and which people were least likely to be missed. This knowledge came not from intelligence, but from proximity. The streets themselves seemed to conspire in their indifference. Trash piled up in corners. Buildings crumbled slowly, unnoticed. Human suffering became another layer of the landscape. In such places, it was easy for something monstrous to hide, not because it was invisible, but because it was unremarkable that Metheny's physical presence made him both noticeable and paradoxically overlooked. People remembered him, but they did not watch him. He was too familiar, too constant. Familiarity breeds a dangerous kind of blindness. When someone becomes part of the scenery, their actions stop triggering alarm at night. These neighborhoods transformed further. Darkness softened outlines and erased details. Streetlights cast long shadows that concealed movement. Metheny's size, once intimidating, became an advantage. Few challenged him. Fewer still followed him. Fear kept distance intact. The city's forgotten streets held countless stories like this, stories of harm that never reached public awareness. Metheny's actions were extreme, but the conditions that enabled them were not unique. They were the result of long-standing social fractures that left entire communities vulnerable. What makes this setting so chilling is not its chaos, but its predictability. The same patterns repeated night after night. People moved through familiar routes. Metheny watched, learned, and waited. There was no urgency to stop him because there was no clear signal that he needed stopping. This chapter of the story is not about a single man's choices alone. It is about the spaces that absorbed those choices without resistance. The streets did not scream. They did not warn. They simply endured. And within that endurance, Joe Metheny found room to become something far worse than anyone imagined. As time passed, the streets Metheny moved through began to feel less like places and more like permissions. Every unlit corner, every boarded window, every unanswered scream reinforced a quiet message. No one was watching closely enough to intervene. In these neighborhoods, danger did not arrive suddenly. It accumulated layer by layer until it became part of the air people breathe. Metheny learned to read this environment with unsettling ease. He recognized when police patrols were light, when certain areas went hours without interruption, and when movement could happen without witnesses. This was not the result of careful study. It was the result of immersion. He lived within the rhythm of these streets, absorbing their patterns the way others absorbed weather. The people he encountered were often exhausted, emotionally, physically, and psychologically. Survival required focus, and focus narrowed attention. When someone disappeared, the absence was felt briefly, then rationalized. People told themselves stories to cope. Maybe they left town. Maybe they were arrested. Maybe something bad happened, but it wasn't their place to ask. These explanations protected sanity, but they also protected predators. Metheny's interactions were often transactional. Conversations were short. Trust was minimal. This suited him. The less people knew about him, the less they could question. He did not need to charm or persuade. He relied on the unspoken rules of the streets. Mind your business. Don't linger. Don't challenge what you can't control. That night, the city seemed to exhale. Activity slowed, but it did not stop. The quiet was deceptive, masking movement rather than eliminating it. Metheny used this time to blend into the flow of nocturnal life. His size made him visible, but visibility did not equal scrutiny. People saw him, then looked away. What makes this period especially haunting is how many opportunities existed for intervention and how none materialized. Metheny was known to be volatile. He was openly aggressive. He threatened people in public spaces. But threats in these neighborhoods were common currency. Words lost their power through overuse. The infrastructure itself contributed to invisibility. Poor lighting, abandoned buildings, and transient populations created gaps where accountability dissolved. Records were incomplete. Addresses changed. Witnesses moved on. Time erased details faster than anyone could document them. Metheny's growing confidence fed off this erosion. Each night that passed without consequence made the next one easier. Violence, once crossed, rarely retreats. It escalates. The absence of resistance became a form of encouragement. Even if unintentional, the city, for its part, continued on. Officials debated policies. Resources were allocated elsewhere. Public attention focused on crimes that fit familiar narratives. Metheny's actions did not yet form a story anyone recognized. They were isolated incidents scattered across a map few cared to examine closely. For the people living there, fear became background noise. You learned when to cross the street, when to stay inside, when to pretend not to notice something wrong. These instincts kept individuals safe in the moment, but collectively, they created blind spots wide enough for horrors to unfold. This is the unsettling truth about forgotten streets. They don't need to hide monsters. They simply need to make them irrelevant. Metheny did not dominate these neighborhoods. He was absorbed by them. His violence became another unspoken burden carried quietly by places already weighed down by too much. As this chapter closes, the streets remain unchanged on the surface. Cars still pass. Lights still flicker. People still move through their days. But beneath that continuity, something irreversible has begun. The conditions are set. The silence is established. And Joe Metheny, fully formed by his past and emboldened by his environment, is approaching the point where his inner rage will no longer remain contained. Chapter 4, Rage, Addiction, and the First Kill. By the time Joe Metheny reached the point where violence crossed an irreversible line, the transformation was not sudden. It was the result of years of accumulated anger, untreated addiction, and a worldview that framed cruelty as justified response. What changed was not who he was, but how far he was willing to go. Alcohol dominated Metheny's daily life. Drinking was no longer occasional or social. It was constant and compulsive. It blurred his memory, lowered his inhibitions, and sharpened his resentment. Under its influence, his anger felt righteous. Every perceived slight became evidence of betrayal. Every frustration demanded release. Sobriety, when it occurred at all, only intensified his agitation. Metheny spent long hours driving through Baltimore's neglected areas, drinking, watching, and replaying grievances in his mind. His thoughts circled familiar themes: women who had rejected him, authority figures who had dismissed him, a world that had failed to recognize his suffering. These were not passing complaints. They were obsessions that fed his sense of entitlement to at some point. Fantasy gave way to intention. Violence no longer existed only as an emotional outlet or a verbal threat. It became a solution. In Metheny's mind, harming others was a way to reclaim control, to assert power in a life where he felt perpetually diminished. The first killing did not unfold as a carefully planned event. It emerged from a convergence of opportunity and rage. Metheny encountered a woman in one of the areas he frequented, someone vulnerable, isolated, and accustomed to risk. The interaction began without drama, shaped by the same transactional expectations that governed many such encounters. There was no immediate sign of what would follow. What happened next was driven by impulse rather than calculation. An argument escalated. Words turned sharp. Metheny's anger, already primed, surged beyond restraint. In that moment, the boundary that had held for years finally collapsed. Violence was no longer imagined. It was enacted. The act itself was brutal and unrestrained. There was no hesitation, no visible conflict between action and conscience. Whatever internal resistance might have existed had long since eroded. When it was over, Metheny was confronted not with guilt, but with a chilling realization. He had crossed a line, and nothing had stopped him. The aftermath was not marked by panic or remorse. Instead, it brought a disturbing sense of calm. The fear he had anticipated did not arrive. The weight of consequence did not immediately follow. The streets remained silent. The world continued on. For Metheny, This absence of immediate reckoning was transformative. This was the moment where violence became normalized within his identity. The act did not destroy him psychologically, it reinforced him. He had acted on his rage and survived. More than that, he had felt powerful. The experience reshaped his internal logic, teaching him that extreme violence was not only possible, but sustainable. Disposal of the body was handled with grim practicality. Metheny relied on the same environmental factors that had protected him before: isolated locations, lack of surveillance, and the assumption that missing individuals would not prompt urgent searches. He did not display panic or urgency. His actions suggested familiarity rather than shock. In the days that followed, Metheny watched for signs of discovery. None came. No police inquiries reached him. No public alerts disrupted his routine. The city absorbed the loss quietly, as it had absorbed so many before. This silence completed the transformation. From this point forward, Metheny no longer viewed murder as an unthinkable act. It became an option, one he knew he could exercise without immediate consequence. The psychological barrier that prevents most people from killing had been dismantled, replaced by a dangerous sense of permission. What makes this stage of the story especially unsettling is its ordinariness. There was no dramatic turning point visible to outsiders. Metheny did not change his habits. He did not flee or isolate himself. He returned to his routines, carrying his secret openly through a city that did not yet know to look for it. This first killing did not satisfy him in the way popular myths often suggest. It did not bring closure or relief. Instead, it deepened his appetite for control. Violence became a language through which he expressed emotions he could not otherwise process. The threshold had been crossed. The pattern was forming. And with each passing day without consequence, Joe Metheny moved further away from any possibility of turning back. After the first killing, Joe Metheny did not retreat into fear or self-reflection. Instead, he settled into a disturbing sense of routine. The world around him appeared unchanged, and that continuity mattered. It told him that what he had done existed outside the boundaries of consequence. For someone who had spent his life feeling powerless, this realization was intoxicating. In the days that followed, Metheny replayed the event in fragments rather than full memories. He did not dwell on the victim as a person. There were no lingering images of fear that disrupted his sleep, no intrusive thoughts demanding remorse. Instead, he focused on the feeling that followed: the quiet, the stillness, the absence of resistance. That emotional imprint became more significant than the act itself. Alcohol continued to play a central role. Drinking helped him smooth over any emerging anxiety and sharpen the edges of his anger once more. The cycle tightened. Rage fueled violence. Violence reinforced drinking, and drinking stripped away whatever remained of restraint. Each element fed the next, forming a closed system that sustained itself. Metheny began to view the streets differently. Where once he had seen chaos, he now saw opportunity. Familiar locations took on new meaning, not as neutral spaces, but as potential stages. His movements became more deliberate, though not carefully planned. He trusted impulse, believing that the environment would protect him as it had before. What followed was not immediate escalation, but repetition. The absence of consequences after the first killing made the possibility of another feel less extreme. Murder was no longer an anomaly. It had entered his behavioral vocabulary. When anger surged again, the solution presented itself naturally, without internal debate. The psychological shift was profound. Metheny stopped seeing violence as a loss of control and began seeing it as an assertion of it. In his mind, he was no longer reacting to the world's cruelty. He was shaping it. This distorted sense of agency became central to his identity. There were moments, however brief, where reality brushed against this illusion. Metheny occasionally sensed that something had changed within him, that he had moved into territory most people never approached. But these moments passed quickly. Alcohol dulled them. Rationalization buried them. He told himself stories that framed his actions as justified responses to betrayal and disrespect. Importantly, there was no external interruption, no sudden police presence, no questioning, no whispers that reached him directly. Each ordinary interaction reinforced the idea that he was invisible. People still avoided him for his temper, not for his crimes. He remained what he had always been in their eyes: dangerous, but not monstrous. This period marked the beginning of a pattern that would grow increasingly entrenched. Metheny learned that he could integrate violence into his life without disrupting its surface structure. He could kill and then return to drinking, working, and wandering the city as if nothing had happened. This compartmentalization allowed him to function without confronting the moral weight of his actions. As weeks passed, his confidence solidified. Fear of being caught faded, replaced by a grim sense of inevitability. Not that he would be stopped, but that this was simply who he was now. The boundary between thought and action continued to erode. Anger no longer needed to build for long. The trigger threshold lowered. Metheny's interactions grew more volatile. He spoke more openly about violence, though still framed as bravado or drunken talk. To those who heard him, these statements sounded like exaggeration, the kind common in bars and on street corners. No one imagined they were listening to confessions. What makes this stage especially disturbing is how unremarkable it appeared from the outside. There were no dramatic changes, no visible spiral. Metheny did not isolate himself or display signs of psychological collapse. He blended seamlessly into the background noise of the city, carrying a private history that no one else could see. Internally, however, something had calcified. The emotional barriers that protect most people from committing repeated acts of violence were gone. In their place was a blunt certainty. He could do this, and nothing would stop him. This realization did not bring satisfaction. It brought momentum. Each act made the next one easier, not because it fulfilled him, but because it normalized the unimaginable. Violence became familiar, almost mundane, stripped of the shock that might have slowed him down. That be why the end of this chapter in his life. Joe Metheny was no longer a man capable of murder. He was a man who had incorporated murder into his sense of self. The streets that had once absorbed his anger were about to absorb far more. And the city, still silent, had no idea what was coming next. Chapter 5. The Women Who Never Came Home. The disappearances did not announce themselves with urgency. They unfolded quietly, one after another, blending into the constant churn of hardship that defined life on Baltimore's margins. These were women whose lives already existed under the weight of invisibility. Women navigating addiction, homelessness, sex work, and unstable relationships. Their absence did not disrupt systems. It simply deepened the silence that surrounded them. Joe Metheny did not see these women as individuals with histories, families, or futures. He saw patterns, vulnerability, familiar routes and routines. He understood who moved through certain streets at certain hours, who was likely to accept a ride, who would not be missed immediately. This understanding was not intellectual. It was observational, shaped by proximity and repetition. Each interaction began without spectacle. Metheny presented himself as he always had: rough, intimidating, but predictable. In environments where danger was constant, predictability could feel safer than the unknown. A familiar face, even an unpleasant one, sometimes felt less risky than a stranger. Metheny relied on this distorted logic. The women he targeted carried their own burdens. Many had histories of trauma that dulled their ability to sense danger. Survival required constant calculation, and those calculations were made under pressure. Choices were rarely between safe and unsafe. They were between bad and worse. Metheny positioned himself within those narrow margins. When a woman failed to return to a known spot or missed a scheduled meeting, the absence was often explained away. Friends assumed arrests, detox admissions, or temporary relocation. Families, when contact existed at all, waited longer before reporting concerns, accustomed to periods of silence. Time passed. Details blurred. Urgency faded. Metheny's violence escalated during this period, but it did so without dramatic outward change. His methods became more consistent. His confidence grew. The psychological distance between him and his victims widened. He no longer needed anger to trigger action. Opportunity was enough. What makes these disappearances particularly haunting is how little record they left behind. Many of the women existed at the edges of documentation. Addresses were outdated. Identification was inconsistent. Without a paper trail, their absence did not generate immediate alarms. The system was not designed to search for people who had already been living without stability. For Metheny, this invisibility functioned as protection. He understood that investigations depended on patterns, and patterns required data. By targeting those least likely to generate that data, he reduced the risk of scrutiny. Each disappearance reinforced the effectiveness of this approach. The emotional impact of these losses rippled quietly through small circles. Friends noticed gaps. Street corners felt emptier. Conversations included names spoken less frequently than not at all. Grief existed, but it was fragmented, shared in murmurs rather than formal mourning. Without confirmation, hope lingered just long enough to delay acceptance. Metheny did not acknowledge this impact. In his internal narrative, the women were not victims. They were symbols of his resentment. He projected his anger onto them, erasing their humanity to justify his actions. This psychological distancing allowed him to continue without confronting the reality of what he was doing. As weeks turned into months, the pattern continued uninterrupted. No coordinated investigation emerged. No media attention focused on the missing. The city's attention remained elsewhere, pulled toward crimes that fit more recognizable narratives. Metheny operated in the gaps between priorities. This chapter of the story is defined not by what happened, but by what didn't. There were no press conferences, no citywide alerts, no collective demand for answers. The women who never came home slipped quietly out of public awareness, leaving behind only faint traces of their existence. And Joe Metheny, emboldened by the absence of resistance, moved forward without hesitation, unaware or unconcerned that each disappearance added weight to a reckoning that had not yet arrived. As the disappearances accumulated, their impact remained diffuse, scattered across lives already stretched thin. There was no single moment when the pattern snapped into focus, no clear signal that demanded attention. Instead, the losses blended into the city's ongoing narrative of struggle. For those who lived close to the streets, absence had many explanations, and hope, however fragile, often delayed the worst conclusions. Joe Metheny continued to move through this landscape with a growing sense of certainty. Each successful evasion reinforced his belief that he understood the rules better than anyone else. He did not rush. He did not change his routines dramatically. He relied on familiarity, his own and that of his surroundings, to keep suspicion at bay. The ordinary nature of his movements became his camouflage. The women he encountered were often exhausted, navigating nights shaped by necessity rather than choice. Conversations were brief and transactional. Metheny offered rides, alcohol, or temporary relief from the street. These offers did not feel extraordinary in context. They felt like compromises made every day in the margins. Trust was not given freely, but desperation narrowed options. What followed these encounters was rarely witnessed. The streets, already practiced in looking away, absorbed the moments that mattered most. Sound carried poorly. Sightlines were broken by abandoned structures and uneven lighting. Even when something felt wrong, intervention was risky. People learned to prioritize their own survival, a calculation that unintentionally shielded Metheny. For those who noticed the pattern, friends, acquaintances, other women working the same areas, the realization came slowly. Names repeated in conversations. Familiar faces failed to reappear. Unease spread, but without clarity. Who do you tell when you don't know what happened? Who listens when you can't provide details? Suspicion without evidence rarely travels far. Metheny's internal detachment deepened. He no longer reflected on individual encounters. They blurred together, stripped of context and consequence. This emotional flattening was not accidental. It was protective. By erasing distinction, he avoided the friction that might have slowed him down. Violence became procedural, not personal. The system's response, or lack of one, continued to reinforce this detachment. Missing persons reports, when filed, were fragmented across jurisdictions and timeframes. Without immediate signs of foul play, cases stalled. The women's lifestyles were often cited as complicating factors, quietly lowering priority. Each administrative pause extended Metheny's window of opportunity. Families, when involved, faced their own barriers. Shame, fear, and strained relationships delayed action. Some held on to hope, believing absence was temporary. Others encountered bureaucratic resistance when they tried to raise alarms. The process itself discouraged persistence, turning grief into a solitary burden. In this environment, Metheny felt increasingly untouchable. He spoke openly about violence in ways that sounded exaggerated, even theatrical. Listeners dismissed his words as drunken bravado. No one imagined the scale of what he had done. The truth was too extreme to fit the image of the man they knew. What makes this chapter particularly devastating is how preventable it feels in hindsight. The warning signs existed, but they were dispersed across people and places that rarely intersected. There was no single vantage point from which the full picture could be seen. Metheny exploited this fragmentation without ever articulating it. As time passed, the emotional toll on the community deepened. Fear circulated quietly. Some women changed routes. Others worked in groups when possible. Rumors surfaced, then faded. Without confirmation, fear struggled to sustain itself. Life demanded forward motion, even when the ground felt unstable. Metheny's actions during this period set the stage for what would come next. Each disappearance was not an endpoint, but a reinforcement of a pattern. The absence of consequence did not merely permit continuation, it encouraged escalation. Boundaries that might have existed dissolved completely. This part of the story ends with a heavy, unresolved quiet. The women who never came home remained unaccounted for, their stories unfinished. The city continued to move, unaware that a reckoning was forming beneath the surface, and Joe Metheny, carried forward by indifference and silence, was moving closer to the point where his secrecy would finally fracture. Chapter 6: Murder Without Remorse. By the time Joe Metheny entered this phase of his life, violence was no longer accompanied by emotional turbulence. The anger that once fueled his actions had settled into something colder and more controlled. What remained was not rage, but indifference. Murder had become an act stripped of drama, carried out without internal resistance or moral hesitation. This was not escalation through excitement. It was escalation through numbness. Metheny no longer framed his actions as reactions to provocation. The need for justification had faded. He did not require an argument, an insult, or a perceived betrayal. Opportunity alone was sufficient. This shift marked a critical psychological turning point. When violence no longer needs an emotional trigger, it becomes far more dangerous. His daily life continued with unsettling normalcy. He drank, wandered, worked sporadically, and interacted with others much as he always had. The absence of visible change made him harder to detect. There were no breakdowns, no erratic departures from routine. The man who committed murder and the man who ordered drinks at a bar were indistinguishable. Internally, Metheny experienced a growing emotional flatness. Feelings that once surged now barely registered. Fear, guilt, and empathy, emotions that might have disrupted his behavior, were largely absent. In their place was a dull sense of control. Violence had become a tool, not an expression. This emotional detachment extended to his victims. He no longer thought of them as people with identities. They were reduced to roles within a process. This dehumanization was not sudden. It was the culmination of years of resentment and psychological distancing. By erasing individuality, he protected himself from reflection. What makes this period especially chilling is how little effort Metheny needed to exert. He did not refine elaborate methods or rituals. He relied on the same environmental advantages that had always shielded him: isolation, neglect, and indifference. The simplicity of his actions made them repeatable. Metheny's confidence was no longer loud or boastful. It was quiet and settled. He moved through the city with the assurance of someone who believed the rules did not apply to him. This belief was reinforced daily by the absence of challenge. Each unremarkable morning after an act of violence strengthened his sense of immunity. There were moments when he tested boundaries, speaking more openly about harm in ways that bordered on confession. But these statements were dismissed, filtered through the lens of his known volatility and alcohol abuse. People heard his words, but did not absorb their meaning. The truth was too heavy to carry. Law enforcement remained unaware of the scale of what was happening. Cases were fragmented, data incomplete. Without a unifying narrative, the individual acts failed to coalesce into a recognizable pattern. Metheny benefited from this fragmentation without needing to manipulate it directly. As his actions continued, Metheny's internal narrative shifted again. He began to see himself as separate from others, not superior in a heroic sense, but exempt. He believed he existed outside the moral structure governing ordinary people. This belief did not come from ideology, it came from experience. The world had not stopped him. This stage of his life reveals a disturbing truth about human behavior. Repetition erodes resistance. What once felt unthinkable becomes manageable, then routine. Metheny did not become more violent because he enjoyed it. He became more violent because nothing intervened to make him stop. The absence of remorse was not theatrical. There were no declarations of hatred or pleasure. There was only continuation. Violence became woven into the fabric of his existence, indistinguishable from any other habit. As this chapter unfolds, the danger is no longer rooted in anger or chaos. It lies in predictability. Metheny's actions followed a pattern that could have continued indefinitely, shielded by the same silence that had always protected him. And while the city remained unaware, the consequences of that silence were growing heavier with every passing day. As Joe Metheny moved deeper into this phase of his life, the line between violence and normality blurred almost completely. What once required emotional momentum now required nothing at all. The absence of inner conflict became its own form of stability. He no longer wrestled with decisions. He followed impulses as if they were routine obligations. Days passed without distinction. Metheny woke, drank, wandered, and slept with the same mechanical rhythm. The acts that separated him from everyone else did not interrupt this rhythm. They existed alongside it, folded into the mundane flow of his life. This integration was perhaps the most dangerous transformation of all, that he no longer watched the news for reports that might connect to him. He did not scan faces for suspicion. Paranoia never took root because nothing had ever forced it to. The system's silence functioned as reassurance. In his experience, extreme acts produced no meaningful reaction. That lesson became foundational. Metheny's emotional numbness deepened into something closer to absence. He did not experience satisfaction or excitement from violence, nor did he feel distress. The acts existed in a neutral emotional space, stripped of significance beyond their immediate function. This neutrality allowed him to continue without psychological strain. Interactions with others remained surface level. People still avoided him, still recognized his volatility, still dismissed his more disturbing comments as empty threats. This social distance protected him. No one looked closely enough to notice changes because there appeared to be none. At times, Metheny reflected on his own past, but these reflections lacked insight. He did not examine cause and effect. He did not question how he arrived where he was. Instead, he framed his life as a sequence of injustices that justified whatever actions followed. Responsibility remained external, always assigned elsewhere. The environment continued to cooperate. The streets offered privacy. The city offered indifference. The victims remained largely undocumented. Every structural weakness worked in his favor. Metheny did not create these conditions. He simply exploited them through presence and persistence. That what's unsettling about this stage is how sustainable it was. There was no visible endpoint. Without interruption, nothing in Metheny's life forced change. His health deteriorated, but slowly. His habits hardened, but predictably. Violence fit seamlessly into this slow decay. There were moments, fleeting and easily dismissed, when Metheny brushed against the reality of what he had become. A look from someone who sensed danger. A conversation that stalled abruptly. These moments did not provoke reflection. They vanished into the fog of alcohol and routine. Law enforcement remained unaware, not through incompetence alone, but through structural limitation. Crimes without witnesses, victims without advocates, and locations without visibility do not generate urgency. Metheny's actions lived in the spaces between priorities. By this point, remorse was not suppressed, it was irrelevant. The emotional capacity required for it had eroded long ago. Metheny did not need to justify himself because he did not feel accountable to anyone or anything. His internal world had narrowed to impulse and repetition. This phase of his life illustrates a chilling reality. When extreme behavior is met with silence, it does not self-correct. It stabilizes. It becomes part of the landscape. Metheny's violence was no longer escalating through intensity, but through persistence. As this chapter closes, the danger lies not in unpredictability, but in continuity. Joe Metheny had become a fixed presence, moving through the city with lethal consistency. The absence of remorse did not make him dramatic or chaotic. It made him efficient, and while the city remained largely unaware, the weight of what he had done, and what he would still do, was quietly accumulating, inching toward a moment when silence would no longer be possible. Chapter 7. The Meat Truck Legend. Long before Joe Metheny's name entered public awareness, a rumor began circulating through Baltimore's most neglected neighborhoods. It didn't arrive as a warning or a headline. It moved the way street stories always do, quietly, unevenly, shaped by fear and disbelief. People spoke of a large man, a truck, and encounters that left others unsettled but unable to explain why. At first, it sounded like exaggeration, the kind born from long nights and anxious minds. Over time, the tone shifted. The story persisted. Metheny's work in and around food distribution and construction placed him in proximity to a refrigerated truck, a detail that would later take on horrifying significance. At the time, it was simply part of his environment, another tool that blended into the industrial landscape of Baltimore. Trucks moved constantly through these areas, hauling goods, parking briefly, then disappearing. Nothing about this stood out on its own, but the presence of that truck, combined with Metheny's size and volatility, began to anchor the rumors. People remembered seeing him parked in certain areas for long periods. Others recalled conversations that felt wrong, remarks that lingered uncomfortably after they were spoken. Still, no one connected these fragments into a coherent threat. The idea was too extreme, too implausible. Street legends often emerge when fear lacks an outlet. They give shape to anxiety without demanding proof. In this case, the legend served as a substitute for understanding. Something bad was happening, people sensed it, but they couldn't define it. The truck became a symbol, a container for unease. Metheny was aware of these whispers, though he did not respond to them. If anything, they reinforced his sense of power. Being feared, even vaguely, aligned with how he saw himself. It validated the intimidation he had always relied on. The difference now was that fear existed independently of direct interaction. His reputation moved ahead of him. What made the rumors especially insidious was their inconsistency. Details changed with each retelling. Locations shifted. The story blurred into myth. This instability made it easier to dismiss. People told themselves it was just another tale meant to scare newcomers or keep others cautious. The truth hid comfortably within that dismissal. Metheny's actions during this period grew more calculated, though not in a sophisticated way. He relied on repetition and familiarity rather than innovation. The truck offered privacy, control, and mobility. In a city where abandoned spaces were plentiful, it did not attract attention. It was simply another industrial presence in a landscape filled with them. The legend did not spread evenly. It remained confined to small circles, women warning each other quietly, conversations cut short when unfamiliar ears were nearby. Fear did not travel upward into systems of authority. It circulated horizontally, among those least equipped to act on it. This uneven spread mattered. Without a clear source or consistent narrative, the story never reached a point where it demanded verification. Law enforcement hears countless rumors. Most dissolve before they reach official channels. This one lingered, but it did not solidify. Metheny continued to move through the city with the confidence of someone who knew how unlikely it was that anyone would look too closely. Even if someone mentioned the truck, even if a story reached the wrong ears, it would lack the specificity required to trigger action. He depended on that vagueness. That what's chilling about this chapter is how close the truth came to the surface without breaking through. The legend brushed against reality repeatedly, never quite aligning with it. People sensed danger but lacked language, evidence, or support to confront it. This way, the meat truck became more than an object. It became a warning that never fully formed, a symbol of how violence can announce itself softly and still go unheard. Metheny existed inside that gap, shielded by disbelief. As the story circulated, it did not slow him down. If anything, it deepened his detachment. He had become an idea as much as a person, and ideas are harder to confront than facts. This part of the legend was still incomplete. The city did not yet know what it was whispering about, but the shape of the truth was beginning to emerge, distorted and unstable, waiting for the moment when denial would no longer hold. As the legend continued to circulate, it began to alter behavior in subtle ways. People didn't confront it directly, they adjusted around it. Some women avoided certain areas after dark. Others declined rides they might once have accepted. A few shared warnings quietly, careful not to sound alarmist. Fear did not crystallize into action, but it did leave fingerprints on routine. Joe Metheny noticed these shifts, though he interpreted them through his own distorted lens. To him, caution from others confirmed his dominance. It suggested respect, even obedience. He did not see it as suspicion closing in. He saw it as evidence that he had presence, that people reacted to him without needing explanation. The truck remained central to this presence. Parked in industrial zones or near construction sites, it looked exactly like what it was supposed to look like. In a city accustomed to noise and movement, it did not stand out. The ordinary nature of the vehicle made it a perfect vessel for extraordinary acts. Familiarity dulled scrutiny, but what's especially disturbing is how close some came to the truth without realizing it. Conversations brushed against reality, then veered away. Someone would mention a detail, another would laugh nervously, and the moment would pass. No one wanted to be the person who took the rumor seriously. Belief carried responsibility, and responsibility felt dangerous. Metheny's demeanor during this period grew increasingly controlled. He spoke less, listened more. He relied on intimidation without escalation. His size and reputation did the work for him. This restraint was not strategic in an intellectual sense. It was intuitive. He felt no urgency to change what was working. The legend also served another purpose. It fragmented attention. Instead of focusing on a man, people focused on a story. Stories shift and mutate. They lose precision. Metheny benefited from this diffusion. The more abstract the fear became, the less likely it was to lead to concrete action. Law enforcement remained distant from these whispers. When concerns did surface, they lacked clarity. Vague descriptions, second-hand accounts, and inconsistent details failed to trigger investigation. The story sounded like folklore, not evidence. It joined a long list of urban myths that rarely demand follow-up. Meanwhile, Metheny's actions continued uninterrupted. The truck moved. The city absorbed. Silence persisted. Each day, without consequence, reinforced the belief that the legend would remain just that, a story without substance. This chapter closes with a sense of near-miss. The truth hovered close enough to be felt, but not close enough to be grasped. The meat truck legend was a warning that never fully arrived, a signal drowned out by disbelief and exhaustion. Soon, however, the story would stop being abstract. Reality would intrude with force, collapsing rumor into fact. And when that happened, the city would finally understand what it had been whispering about all along. Chapter 8: Cannibalism and the Ultimate Dehumanization. By the time Joe Metheny crossed into this most disturbing territory, the psychological groundwork had already been laid. Cannibalism did not emerge as a shocking deviation from his behavior. It emerged as an extension of a mindset that had been stripping humanity from others for years. Long before bodies were reduced to objects, people had been reduced to roles. This was the final step in a process of total dehumanization. Metheny later spoke about these acts with unsettling casualness, as if describing something mundane rather than profoundly taboo. What stood out was not cruelty in his tone, but detachment. He did not frame cannibalism as a thrill or a ritual. He described it as practical, almost incidental. That framing reveals something crucial about his inner world. By this point, Moral boundaries had lost all meaning. To understand how such a line could be crossed, it's important to recognize that Metheny no longer experienced his victims as human beings. They had become symbols of his resentment, containers for his anger, and ultimately, resources to be used. Cannibalism was not driven by hunger in a literal sense. It was driven by domination. It was the ultimate assertion that another person's existence had no value beyond his control over it. The environments Metheny operated in made this possible. Industrial areas, isolated properties, and spaces associated with food processing created cover. Nothing about his surroundings contradicted what he was doing. The ordinary and the horrific coexisted without friction. This normalization further eroded any remaining psychological resistance. What makes this phase especially chilling is how it fits seamlessly into Metheny's routine. There was no dramatic shift in behavior, no sudden isolation, no visible signs of internal conflict. Cannibalism did not disrupt his life, it integrated into it. This integration speaks to the depth of his detachment that Metheny's later explanation suggested that he derived a sense of power from the act, not excitement, but erasure. Consuming another person symbolized complete ownership. It was the final denial of individuality. In his distorted logic, it reduced his victims to something less than human, retroactively justifying everything he had done. Importantly, there was no audience for this behavior. It was not performative. There were no attempts to shock or provoke. The secrecy was total, not because he feared consequences, but because the acts themselves existed outside any social framework. They belonged entirely to his private reality. The absence of witnesses and consequences reinforced this reality. Metheny did not encounter obstacles that might have forced self-reflection. No one interrupted him. No one questioned him. The world remained indifferent. This indifference allowed the unimaginable to feel routine. Psychologically, this represents a complete collapse of empathy. Not a temporary lapse, but a structural absence. Metheny did not experience his actions as violations. He experienced them as expressions of control in a life where control had always felt scarce. That it's important to emphasize that cannibalism in this context was not about shock value. It was not driven by curiosity or fantasy. It was a manifestation of total emotional erosion. The act itself was less significant than what it represented. The final step in reducing other people to objects as this chapter unfolds, the story reaches one of its darkest points, not because of graphic detail, but because of what it reveals about how far a human being can drift when violence goes unchecked. Metheny had moved beyond rage, beyond fear, beyond remorse. What remained was emptiness, filled only by habit and domination. The city still did not know. The legend remained incomplete. The truth, now almost unbearable, continued to exist in silence. And while the acts themselves were hidden, their weight was accumulating, pressing toward a moment when concealment would no longer be possible. What followed this descent was not escalation in spectacle, but deepening in meaning. Cannibalism became the clearest expression of how completely Joe Metheny had severed himself from ordinary human reference points. By consuming his victims, he erased the final boundary that separates violence from annihilation. There was no longer a body to mourn, no remains to mark a life that had ended. What was left was absence, total and irreversible. That Metheny's internal world during this period was defined by a strange calm. There was no urgency, no sense of impending discovery. He moved through his days as if nothing extraordinary were occurring. This calm was not peace, it was emotional vacancy. The acts that should have shattered him psychologically barely registered. They occupied the same mental space as any other routine task. What allowed this was not just personal pathology, but environment. The spaces he used insulated him from interruption. Industrial settings are designed for efficiency, not intimacy. They strip processes of personal meaning. In such places, transformation happens without ceremony. Metheny's actions existed within that logic, hidden in plain function. He did not reflect on the implications of what he was doing. Reflection requires distance, and Metheny lived too close to his impulses to gain any. The world he inhabited reinforced detachment at every turn. No one asked questions. No one demanded explanation. Silence remained intact. There is a temptation to search for symbolism in acts this extreme, to assign them ritual or ideology. But in Metheny's case, there was none. The absence of symbolism is what makes it so disturbing. Cannibalism was not sacred or meaningful to him. It was utilitarian. That banality strips away any illusion that such acts require grand motivation. Sometimes, they require only unchecked emptiness. As time passed, even this behavior failed to produce any emotional response. It did not shock him. It did not satisfy him. It simply existed. This emotional flattening reveals the endpoint of prolonged violence without consequence. Not thrill, but void. Metheny was no longer driven by desire or hatred. He was driven by momentum. The city remained unaware of how far things had gone. The rumors still lacked clarity. The legends still lacked proof. Without discovery, there was no disruption. The absence of confrontation allowed Metheny's private reality to persist unchallenged. This phase of the story underscores a critical truth about extreme violence. It does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it unfolds quietly, sustained by indifference rather than chaos. Metheny's actions were not fueled by dramatic breakdowns, but by the steady erosion of boundaries. As this chapter closes, the story stands at its darkest point. The acts committed cannot be undone. The humanity stripped away cannot be restored. What remains is a tension, an imbalance between what has happened and what the world knows. That imbalance cannot last forever. Soon, silence will fracture. The private reality Metheny has lived within will collide with the public world. And when it does, the legend will finally collapse into truth. Chapter 9. Close Calls and Missed Chances. By the time Joe Metheny reached this phase of his crimes, the distance between exposure and concealment had narrowed dangerously. The silence that had protected him for so long began to develop small fractures, moments where chance, instinct, or circumstance came close to interrupting his routine. These were not dramatic confrontations or sweeping investigations. They were brief, fragile opportunities that appeared and vanished, leaving no lasting mark. Metheny did not recognize these moments as warnings. In his mind, they were inconveniences at most, easily absorbed into the flow of his life. His confidence, hardened by years without consequence, filtered out any signal that might have suggested danger. Near misses did not provoke caution. They reinforced his belief that he could navigate anything that came his way. There were instances when people sensed something was wrong and acted on instinct. A sudden refusal, a decision to walk away, a moment of hesitation that broke routine. These decisions, small and often unremarked, prevented harm without ever revealing how close it had come. Metheny did not dwell on these moments. He simply moved on, seeking the next opportunity. Other close calls came from chance encounters. A car passing unexpectedly, a voice carried farther than anticipated, a figure appearing in a place he believed to be empty. Each time, the situation dissolved before it could escalate. The city's constant motion created cover as effectively as its stillness. What makes these near exposures so unsettling is how easily they could have altered the course of events. A single witness lingering longer, a question asked at the wrong time, a report taken more seriously. Any of these could have forced scrutiny. None did. Metheny's demeanor during this period reflected complete emotional insulation. He did not display nervousness or heightened alertness. His behavior remained consistent, even when circumstances shifted unexpectedly. This steadiness made him appear unremarkable. People expect guilt to announce itself through agitation. Metheny offered no such cues. Law enforcement encountered fragments of information that, in hindsight, carried weight. Vague reports, incomplete tips, accounts that lacked detail or consistency. Each fragment, on its own, seemed insufficient to justify action. Together, they formed a pattern that remained unseen. Institutional limitations played a role. Resources were finite. Priorities were set by urgency and visibility. Crimes that lacked immediate evidence or vocal advocates struggled to rise above the noise. Metheny's actions continued to exist in the margins, shielded by the same structural gaps that had protected him from the beginning. There were also moments when Metheny himself edged closer to self-disclosure. Alcohol loosened his restraint, and his words occasionally drifted toward truth. He spoke of violence with an ease that unsettled listeners, but his tone remained detached, almost bored. Without emotional intensity, his statements sounded like exaggeration rather than confession. Listeners reacted by distancing themselves, not by investigating further. The discomfort his words caused did not translate into action. People avoided him, reinforcing the social isolation that had always defined his life. This avoidance reduced scrutiny rather than increasing it. What's striking about this chapter is how fragile the boundary between secrecy and exposure had become without anyone realizing it. Metheny's invisibility was no longer absolute. It depended increasingly on coincidence and inertia. The system was not actively protecting him. It was simply failing to see him clearly. Each missed chance added to a quiet accumulation of inevitability. The longer Metheny continued, the more likely it became that something would disrupt his pattern. But inevitability does not arrive on a schedule. It waits, silent, until the smallest shift tips the balance. As this chapter unfolds, the story is defined by what almost happened. The moments that came close, then slipped away. The questions that formed, then dissolved. The warnings that hovered, then vanished. Joe Metheny remained free, not because he was invulnerable, but because the world around him was fragmented. That fragmentation could not hold forever, and somewhere within those cracks, the path toward exposure was already forming, quietly and without announcement. As time moved forward, the close calls began to cluster, not in one place or moment, but across a widening field of chance encounters and near discoveries. The margin that had once protected Joe Metheny with ease now required constant luck. Still, he did not recognize this shift. His internal compass, long disconnected from reality, told him everything was under control. Some of the near exposures came from those who survived encounters with him. They carried impressions that lingered, details that didn't sit right, moments that felt threatening without clear cause. Yet memory alone rarely compels action. Without concrete harm, these experiences remained personal warnings rather than public alerts. Other moments came from environmental changes. Construction sites closed. Lots that had once been empty gained activity. Areas that had offered privacy became unpredictable. Each change narrowed Metheny's operational space slightly. He adapted instinctively, moving rather than reflecting. Adaptation had always been his strength. Law enforcement continued to receive fragments that, if assembled, might have revealed more. Tips without follow-up. Reports without context. Information entered systems that did not communicate efficiently. Patterns remained scattered, each piece isolated within its own administrative boundary. Metheny's health also began to decline during this period. Years of heavy drinking and neglect took their toll. Physical discomfort increased, but it did not slow him down. If anything, it intensified his irritability and further dulled his capacity for self-awareness. Pain became background noise. Despite these pressures, his behavior remained outwardly unchanged. This consistency was deceptive. It masked the growing instability beneath. The absence of visible stress signals delayed suspicion. Metheny did not behave like someone on the verge of exposure. He behaved like someone accustomed to getting away with things. That what's particularly unsettling is how many people brushed against the truth without grasping it. A comment overheard, a strange sight dismissed, a feeling ignored. Each moment carried potential, and each dissolved into the everyday flow of the city. The system, designed to respond to clear signals, struggled with ambiguity. Metheny's crimes existed in that ambiguity. Without bodies, without witnesses, without immediate threat to visible populations, urgency remained low. This gap between harm and recognition allowed the pattern to continue to as these missed chances accumulated. They created a quiet pressure, not a dramatic countdown, but a subtle tightening. The environment that had once absorbed Metheny effortlessly was becoming less forgiving. The city was changing. Attention shifted. The margin for error shrank. Metheny, however, remained psychologically static. He did not adjust his self-concept. He did not anticipate consequences. He continued to operate as if the past guaranteed the future. This assumption would prove fatal to his secrecy. This chapter closes with a sense of approaching collision. The system had not caught up, but it was closer than ever before. The silence was thinning. The legend was losing its abstraction. Reality was pressing in from multiple directions. Joe Metheny was still free, still invisible in many ways. But invisibility, once cracked, rarely restores itself completely. And soon, one missed chance would turn into something else entirely, an interruption that could not be ignored. Chapter 10. The Victim Who Escaped. The pattern that had protected Joe Metheny for so long was never broken by a sweeping investigation or a dramatic confession. It fractured because one person survived. In a story shaped by silence and absence, survival became the loudest possible disruption. The woman who escaped did not set out to expose a killer. She was not looking for justice or recognition. She was doing what countless others had done, navigating a night shaped by necessity, fatigue, and limited choices. Her encounter with Metheny began in a way that felt familiar enough not to trigger immediate alarm. He was intimidating, yes, but so were many men she encountered. Familiar danger often feels safer than unknown risk. What followed, however, felt different. The atmosphere shifted in ways that were difficult to articulate in the moment. Small details registered instinctively. The way Metheny's demeanor hardened, the sense of isolation closing in, the realization that the situation was slipping beyond control. Survival instincts surfaced, sharp and urgent. In that moment, the difference between life and death came down to timing, chance, and resistance. The woman fought back, not with certainty, not with a plan, but with desperation. She seized an opening and fled. The escape was chaotic, ungraceful, and incomplete, but it was enough. Metheny did not pursue her with the intensity that might have ended the story differently. Whether through surprise, miscalculation, or simple overconfidence, the moment passed. The routine was broken. For the first time, someone left an encounter with him carrying more than unease. She carried knowledge. Survival, however, did not immediately translate into action. Trauma has a way of fragmenting memory and muting urgency. The woman was shaken, frightened, and unsure how to interpret what had happened. She knew she had been in danger, but articulating that danger to others felt overwhelming. Still, something compelled her forward. Perhaps it was the clarity that comes after near loss, or the awareness that escape was rare. Whatever the reason, she spoke. She described Metheny, the truck, the circumstances. Her account carried specificity that rumors never had. This time, the story did not dissolve. Details aligned with fragments that had been circulating quietly for years. The truck, the man, the areas. What had once sounded like folklore began to resemble evidence. Law enforcement responded cautiously at first. Skepticism remained. But the woman's account contained enough coherence to warrant attention. It did not stand alone, it connected. And connection is what had been missing all along. For Metheny, this moment passed unnoticed at first. He continued his routines, unaware that the silence protecting him had been breached. He did not sense pursuit. He did not feel pressure closing in. The system moved slowly, but this time, it moved with direction. The escape marked a turning point not because it revealed everything, but because it changed the narrative. For the first time, Metheny's actions were not abstract or secondhand. They were described by someone who had been there, someone who had lived. This chapter of the story shifts the balance. The anonymity that had shielded Metheny begins to erode. The legend sharpens. The city starts to listen. And while Joe Metheny remains unaware, the path toward exposure has finally been set in motion. Survival did not end the danger. It transformed it. In the days following her escape, the woman carried fear like a second skin. Ordinary sounds startled her. Familiar streets felt altered. Memory replayed itself in fragments, not as a clear sequence, but as sensations, pressure, panic, the certainty that something terrible had almost happened. Trauma rarely arrives with clarity. It arrives with urgency and doubt tangled together. Speaking about what she had endured required a different kind of courage. She knew the risks of not being believed. She understood how stories from the margins are often filtered through skepticism. Still, she returned to the details again and again, grounding herself in what she could describe with certainty. The man, the truck, the location, the moment when instinct screamed that escape was the only option. When authorities listened, they did so carefully, not with immediate alarm, but with attention sharpened by context. Her account did not exist in isolation. It resonated with earlier fragments, unverified tips, rumors that had never fully taken shape, sightings that once seemed insignificant. What had been scattered now had a center of gravity. Investigators began to trace the outline of a pattern, not all at once, not dramatically, but steadily. The description of the truck matched reports that had never coalesced. The man's size, demeanor, and habits aligned with a figure already known for volatility. The story gained weight through connection rather than shock. For the woman, cooperation was exhausting. Retelling the story reopened fear. Each question demanded precision when her memory resisted order. Yet she persisted. Somewhere beneath the fear was a quiet resolve. She understood that survival had given her a responsibility she had not chosen but could not ignore. Meanwhile, Joe Metheny continued on, unaware that the ground beneath him was shifting. He moved through familiar spaces with the same confidence he always had. There were no sirens chasing him, no visible signs of scrutiny. The illusion of safety remained intact until it didn't. Behind the scenes, attention narrowed. Investigators compared notes. They revisited overlooked information. What once felt like noise began to form a signal. The system, slow to start, began to focus. This is often how long-hidden violence surfaces, not through a single revelation, but through accumulation. One account gains traction, It invites others. Patterns emerge. Silence gives way to structure. For the woman who escaped, the process was not about closure. It was about interruption. She had disrupted something that thrived on invisibility. Even if the full truth remained hidden, the machinery that allowed it to continue had been damaged. As this chapter closes, the balance has shifted decisively. The city does not yet know what it is about to learn, but the path forward is no longer obscured. The escape has done what years of rumor could not. Joe Metheny is no longer just a shadow moving through forgotten streets. He is a subject of interest, a focus, a name approaching the surface. And from this point on, the story accelerates toward confrontation, confession, and a reckoning that will force the city to finally face what it allowed to remain unseen. Chapter 11. The Arrest That Shocked America. The arrest of Joe Metheny did not arrive with flashing lights and dramatic chases. It unfolded quietly, almost cautiously, as if the system itself needed time to accept what it was closing in on. For years, Metheny had existed in the margins, his actions absorbed by silence and disbelief. Now, that silence was thinning, and the man who had relied on it was about to step into full view. Investigators moved deliberately. The information provided by the woman who escaped had reshaped their focus, but it did not erase the complexity of the case. There were still gaps, missing victims without records, rumors without documentation, years of neglect layered over potential evidence. The challenge was not only to stop Metheny, but to understand the scope of what he had done. Surveillance began subtly. Officers observed his movements, his routines, the spaces he frequented. What they saw was not a man hiding in panic, but one continuing life as usual. Metheny drank, wandered, and interacted with others with the same coarse familiarity. His calm was not confidence born of innocence, but confidence built on experience. He had lived too long without consequence to imagine one was coming. The arrest itself came without resistance. When officers approached Metheny, he did not flee. He did not argue. There was no visible shock on his face. The moment registered as an interruption, not a collapse. This reaction, understated and unsettling, would later become one of the most disturbing details of the case. News of the arrest spread unevenly at first. Local authorities understood the sensitivity of what they were uncovering. They knew that premature statements could inflame fear or compromise investigation. Still, whispers began to circulate. The man associated with the rumors, the truck, the disappearances, pieces that had never fit together suddenly aligned. As details emerged, disbelief followed. The scale of what Metheny was suspected of defied easy comprehension. Cannibalism, serial murder, years of unchecked violence. These were not crimes the public expected to find hidden in plain sight. The contrast between Metheny's unremarkable public presence and the allegations against him was jarring. For those who had known him casually, the arrest forced a reckoning. Memories were re-examined. Conversations replayed. Remarks once dismissed as drunken exaggeration took on new meaning. The realization that they had been in proximity to something monstrous left a residue of shock and guilt. Law enforcement faced a different reckoning. Questions emerged about missed opportunities, ignored warnings, and systemic blind spots. The arrest did not just reveal a killer. It exposed the conditions that had allowed him to operate for so long. Accountability extended beyond the individual. Metheny's demeanor in custody remained disturbingly consistent. He did not display fear or remorse. He answered questions without urgency, as if participating in a routine exchange. This emotional flatness unsettled those who interacted with him. It suggested not confusion or denial, but acceptance. As investigators prepared to dig deeper, They understood that the arrest was only the beginning. Stopping Metheny was necessary, but understanding him and accounting for his victims would be far more difficult. The years of silence had left deep gaps that might never be fully filled. The public reaction intensified as more information surfaced. Media coverage expanded. Headlines hardened. What had once been rumor was now national news. The city of Baltimore found itself confronting a reality that challenged its sense of safety and its assumptions about where extreme violence comes from. This chapter marks a turning point not just in the narrative, but in collective awareness. The invisible had become visible. The unthinkable had been named. And while Joe Metheny sat quietly in custody, the weight of what he had done, and what the world was only beginning to understand, settled heavily over a city forced to face its own silence. Once Joe Metheny was in custody, the atmosphere surrounding the case shifted from disbelief to dread. Investigators understood that the arrest had opened a door they could not close again. Every answer would lead to more questions, and every question carried the weight of lives already lost. The task ahead was not simply to confirm guilt, but to reconstruct years of violence that had unfolded in near-total darkness. Interrogations began cautiously. Metheny was not pressured aggressively at first. Detectives observed him, listening as much to what he did not say as to what he did. His posture remained relaxed. His tone was steady. He did not ask for reassurance or protest his innocence. This calm was not strategic. It was habitual. He had lived too long without accountability to feel threatened by it. When Metheny began to speak, the effect was chilling. His statements lacked emotional inflection. He described events without urgency or hesitation, as though recounting errands rather than crimes. There was no attempt to minimize or dramatize. The absence of effect made his words heavier, not lighter. Investigators would later describe this as one of the most disturbing aspects of the case. As details emerged, authorities realized the scope of the investigation would stretch far beyond initial expectations. Some victims could be identified, others could not. The transient nature of their lives meant records were sparse or non-existent. Names had been lost long before bodies ever were. Each missing piece represented not only a victim, but a family left without answers. For law enforcement, the arrest triggered internal review. Files were reopened, tips re-examined. The quiet question hovered. How had this gone on for so long? The answer was not simple. It lived in the intersection of limited resources, societal neglect, and the uncomfortable truth that some lives receive less urgency than others. Public reaction intensified as fragments of Metheny's confessions reached the media. The story spread rapidly, fueled by disbelief and horror. People struggled to reconcile the man described on screen with the scale of his crimes. The idea that such violence could exist unnoticed challenged assumptions about safety and oversight. Metheny himself appeared unaffected by the attention. Media coverage did not provoke reaction. He did not seek notoriety or deny allegations. He existed within the process as he had existed outside it, detached, unmoved, and emotionally opaque. This indifference stripped the narrative of any familiar framework. There was no remorse to analyze, no visible breakdown to interpret. As investigators pieced together timelines, they encountered gaps that would never be filled. Some remains could not be recovered. Some identities could not be confirmed. The silence that had protected Metheny now obstructed justice for his victims. What had once shielded him now compounded the harm. This realization weighed heavily on those involved. Closure, if it came at all, would be partial. The arrest ended Metheny's ability to continue, but it could not undo the years lost to invisibility. The city was forced to confront not only the crimes themselves, But the conditions that had allowed them to persist be why the end of this phase. One truth was clear. The arrest had not concluded the story. It had only shifted its focus. The questions now turned inward, toward accountability, toward prevention, toward the uncomfortable acknowledgement that extreme violence often thrives where attention is absent. Joe Metheny remained in custody, outwardly unchanged. But the world around him had transformed. Silence had given way to scrutiny. Rumor had hardened into record. And as the case moved forward, the next chapter would force a deeper confrontation, not just with what Metheny had done, but with how easily it had been allowed to happen. Chapter 12. Confessions Too Horrifying to Believe. When Joe Metheny began to confess, the horror of the case shifted from speculation to certainty. What had once been fragments, rumors, survivor accounts, partial evidence, started to align into a narrative that was almost unbearable in its clarity. Investigators were prepared for brutality. What they were not prepared for was the manner in which Metheny spoke about it. There was no visible struggle in his words, no hesitation, no emotional spikes. He spoke as if recounting events that belonged to someone else, or to a version of himself long disconnected from consequence. His tone was steady, sometimes even casual. The lack of emotion did not soften the impact, it magnified it. Violence delivered without feeling carries a different weight. Metheny did not frame his confessions as admissions of guilt in a moral sense. He did not say he was sorry. He did not say he regretted what he had done. Instead, he described actions as facts, stripped of interpretation. In doing so, he forced investigators to confront the reality that remorse was not part of his internal landscape. Some details were provided freely. Others emerged only when prompted. But throughout, Metheny showed no concern for how his words would be received. He did not ask how much authorities already knew. He did not attempt to negotiate or deflect. This absence of self-preservation was deeply unsettling. It suggested not resignation, but indifference. As the confessions continued, investigators struggled to verify what could be verified. Some statements aligned with known disappearances. Others referenced individuals who could not be traced. Each unverified confession opened a new wound. Another possible victim without a name. Another family without closure. The most disturbing aspects of Metheny's confessions were not graphic descriptions, but the reasoning he offered. He spoke of anger, betrayal, and resentment as if they were self-evident explanations. In his mind, these emotions justified everything that followed. The leap from feeling wrong to committing irreversible harm appeared seamless to him. There was no attempt to understand the suffering of others. Victims were referenced obliquely, without personal detail. Names mattered less than actions. This dehumanization was consistent with everything investigators had already observed. Metheny did not see people, he saw functions. For those listening, the experience was disorienting. Confessions are often expected to follow a familiar script: emotion, justification, breakdown. Metheny offered none of these. He spoke plainly, as if narrating a routine. The contrast between content and delivery created a chilling effect that lingered long after interviews ended. A word of the confessions reached the public, disbelief followed. The sheer extremity of the crimes challenged comprehension. Many struggled to accept that such acts could occur without detection, without interruption, without outrage. The story seemed unreal precisely because it had unfolded so quietly. Law enforcement faced the grim task of translating Metheny's words into evidence. Each confession required corroboration. Each claim demanded investigation. Time worked against them. Years had passed. Locations had changed. Physical traces had disappeared. The silence that had once protected Metheny now complicated justice. This chapter marks a shift from discovery to reckoning. Confession did not bring clarity. It revealed how much clarity had been lost. The truth emerged unevenly, incomplete and fragmented, echoing the way the crimes themselves had occurred. And as Metheny continued to speak, it became clear that the full scope of what he had done might never be known. Not because he withheld it, but because the world had failed to record it when it mattered most. As Joe Metheny's confessions continued, a disturbing pattern emerged, not just in what he admitted to, but in how he understood his own actions. He did not speak as someone seeking relief through truth. He spoke as someone clarifying a record, filling in details as if accuracy itself were the goal. This orientation stripped confession of its redemptive meaning. There was no catharsis, only disclosure. Investigators noticed that Metheny often framed his actions in practical terms. He spoke about locations, timing, and methods with the detached clarity of someone describing routine tasks. When asked about the people involved, his language remained vague. Individuals blurred into categories. The absence of names was not always intentional. It reflected how thoroughly he had erased individuality from his internal narrative. Some statements were chilling precisely because of their mundanity. He did not embellish. He did not dramatize. The horror lay in the normalcy of his delivery. Listeners were forced to reconcile the enormity of the acts with the flatness of the voice describing them. This dissonance made the confessions difficult to process, even for seasoned investigators. Verification proved agonizingly slow. Each confession sent teams back into the field, retracing years-old paths through neighborhoods that had changed beyond recognition. Buildings were gone. Lots had been redeveloped. Witnesses had moved on or passed away. The city itself had shifted, carrying the past forward without preserving its details. Families waiting for answers encountered a painful ambiguity. Some confessions aligned with long-standing fears. Others introduced new possibilities without resolution. Closure, when it came, was incomplete. The truth emerged in pieces, each fragment illuminating loss while leaving gaps that could never be filled. Metheny did not react to these struggles. He showed no awareness of the emotional weight his words carried. When confronted with the impact on families, he did not respond with defensiveness or reflection. He simply acknowledged the statements and moved on. This absence of engagement reinforced the sense that he existed outside the emotional economy shared by others. Public reaction to the confessions deepened the shock. Media coverage struggled to balance fact with restraint. The extremity of the crimes invited sensationalism, yet the reality resisted simple framing. This was not a story of theatrical evil. It was a story of quiet, sustained violence enabled by neglect. As details circulated, attention turned inward. Questions emerged about systemic failure, about whose lives are prioritized, about how long violence can persist when it targets the invisible. Metheny's confessions did not just expose his actions. They exposed the gaps that allowed them. For law enforcement, the process became a race against loss of memory, of evidence, of opportunity to honor victims with certainty. Each unverified confession represented a story that might never be told fully. This limitation weighed heavily, underscoring how time and indifference compound harm. Metheny, meanwhile, remained unchanged. Confession did not soften him. It did not harden him. It simply occupied space. He existed within the process as he had existed outside it, detached, unresponsive to consequence, insulated from reflection. This chapter ends not with revelation, but with an unsettling acceptance. The truth, once hidden, had emerged, but too late to be whole. The confessions provided answers, but they also confirmed how much had been lost to silence. As the case moved forward, the focus would shift again from what Metheny admitted to toward how society would respond. Trial, judgment, and legacy awaited, and with them, the final confrontation, not just with a killer, but with the conditions that allowed him to exist unseen for so long. Chapter 13. Inside the Mind of Joe Metheny. Understanding Joe Metheny does not mean excusing him. It means confronting the uncomfortable reality of how a human mind can hollow itself out over time, leaving behind something capable of sustained, extreme violence without visible conflict. This chapter does not search for sympathy. It searches for clarity that Metheny's inner world was not chaotic in the way people often imagine. There were no grand delusions, no elaborate fantasies of greatness, no theatrical self-mythology. What defined his psychology was absence of empathy, of accountability, of emotional depth. His mind was shaped less by complexity than by erosion. From an early age, Metheny learned to interpret the world through threat and grievance. Experiences of neglect and violence did not teach him resilience. They taught him suspicion. Over time, this suspicion hardened into a worldview where others existed primarily as sources of harm or frustration. Trust never took root. Connection never stabilized. As he grew older, this worldview became self-reinforcing. Each failed relationship, each dismissal, each rejection confirmed what he already believed, that the world was hostile and unfair. Rather than questioning this belief, he used it as justification. Responsibility was always external. Blame flowed outward, never inward. One of the most striking aspects of Metheny's psychology was his lack of internal dialogue around morality. He did not debate right and wrong. He did not wrestle with conscience. These concepts simply did not function as governing forces in his decision-making. Actions were evaluated based on utility and outcome, not ethics. Alcohol played a critical role in maintaining this mental structure. Drinking dulled whatever emotional friction might have existed and amplified his sense of grievance. It also disrupted memory and impulse control, allowing actions to occur without reflection. Over time, this chemical reinforcement further flattened his emotional range. Metheny's sense of self was fragile but rigid. He saw himself as someone who had been denied respect and agency. Violence became a way to reclaim both. Importantly, this was not about pleasure. It was about control. Control over bodies, over situations, over a world he felt had always controlled him. What's chilling is how ordinary this internal logic appeared to him. He did not experience himself as monstrous. He experienced himself as justified. This self-perception insulated him from doubt and allowed violence to integrate seamlessly into his identity. There was no clear line between his public and private selves. He did not maintain a facade of normalcy while hiding a secret life. His volatility, aggression, and resentment were visible. The difference was not concealment, but interpretation. Others saw these traits as signs of dysfunction. Metheny saw them as evidence of strength. Empathy, when tested, failed completely. He did not imagine the inner lives of others. He did not anticipate their suffering. This absence made it possible to commit acts that would psychologically devastate most people. Without emotional mirroring, there was no internal break. Psychologically, Metheny fits less into the category of a calculating predator and more into that of a deeply stunted individual whose emotional development never matured beyond grievance. This does not lessen the severity of his crimes. It underscores how dangerous emotional underdevelopment can become when paired with opportunity and neglect. This chapter is difficult because it resists easy explanation. There is no single cause, no defining trauma that unlocks understanding. Metheny was shaped by accumulation of neglect, resentment, addiction, and silence. Each factor alone might not have produced catastrophe. Together, they did that. As this exploration continues, one truth becomes clear. Joe Metheny did not snap. He calcified. His humanity eroded slowly, imperceptibly, until nothing remained to counter his impulses, and once that erosion was complete, there was nothing inside him that wanted to stop. To look deeper into Joe Metheny's mind is to confront an unsettling truth. There was no dramatic psychological break that transformed him into something else. What existed at the end was the same structure that had been forming for decades, simply stripped of restraint. His inner life did not explode. It emptied. Metheny's emotional world operated on a narrow bandwidth. Anger registered clearly. Frustration registered loudly. Everything else faded into noise. Joy, curiosity, tenderness, and guilt never developed enough to compete. Over time, this imbalance became permanent. Emotional responses that might have slowed him down simply did not arise. One of the most dangerous elements of Metheny's psychology was his resistance to introspection. He did not reflect on his actions in a way that produced insight. Reflection, when it occurred, served only to reinforce grievance. He revisited memories not to understand them, but to weaponize them. Every past hurt became proof that the world owed him something. This mindset insulated him from learning. Consequences, when minor, did not alter behavior. They were absorbed as further injustice. Without the ability to self-correct, Metheny repeated patterns until they hardened into identity. Violence was not a deviation. It was consistency. Metheny's sense of time was also distorted. He lived largely in the present, reacting to immediate stimuli rather than considering long-term outcomes. This present-focused orientation made planning unnecessary and remorse irrelevant. The future existed only as a vague extension of the now, not as a space requiring accountability. When professionals later evaluated his behavior, what stood out was not complexity, but rigidity. His thinking was fixed, circular, and resistant to nuance. People were either threats or tools. Situations were either wins or losses. There was no middle ground. This black-and-white cognition simplified the world at the cost of humanity. Importantly, Metheny did not crave recognition. He did not seek to be understood or remembered. His confessions lack performative elements because performance requires an audience that matters. To Metheny, others existed only insofar as they impacted him. Public perception was irrelevant. This absence of narcissistic exhibitionism sets him apart from many infamous killers. He did not construct a myth around himself. He did not see himself as special. He saw himself as justified. That distinction matters because it explains why his violence remained so quiet for so long. Control remained the central organizing principle of his psychology. Control over his environment. Control over interactions. Control over bodies. Where control was absent, anger surged. Where control was established, emotion receded. Violence became the fastest way to restore equilibrium. Alcohol continued to reinforce this system by suppressing any emotional signals that might have disrupted it. Over time, the chemical and psychological components fused. Metheny's identity became inseparable from the numbness that sustained him. What makes this analysis especially difficult is the lack of narrative closure. There is no insight gained at the end, no realization that reframes his actions. Metheny did not evolve. He stagnated. His inner life reached a point where change was no longer possible because the capacity for change had eroded. This chapter closes with a sobering recognition. The most dangerous minds are not always the most dramatic. Sometimes, they are the most empty. Joe Metheny did not commit his crimes because he was overwhelmed by emotion. He committed them because emotion no longer restrained him. And when empathy disappears completely, there is nothing left to negotiate with, only behavior waiting for opportunity. Chapter 14: Trial, Sentencing, and Prison Life. The legal process that followed Joe Metheny's arrest unfolded under the weight of extraordinary expectation. The crimes attributed to him challenged the boundaries of what the justice system was accustomed to handling, not only in their severity, but in their complexity. Years of silence had left behind fragmented evidence, incomplete records, and unanswered questions. The courtroom would become a place not just of judgment, but of reconstruction. The trial did not begin with spectacle. There were no dramatic entrances, no theatrical displays of emotion from the defendant. Metheny appeared as he always had, large, impassive, and emotionally opaque. His presence filled the room physically, but not emotionally. He did not look toward the families. He did not avert his gaze. He simply existed within the space, unmoved by its significance. Prosecutors faced a formidable task. Some charges rested on confessions corroborated by evidence. Others depended on testimony, circumstantial links, and the painful absence of remains. The narrative they presented had to bridge gaps created by years of neglect and invisibility. Each missing piece represented not weakness in the case, but a life lost without documentation. Metheny did not contest the proceedings in a conventional way. He did not mount an aggressive defense or attempt to discredit witnesses. His participation was minimal, his demeanor unchanged. This lack of resistance unsettled observers. It suggested not acceptance of guilt, but disengagement from the process itself. Testimony unfolded methodically. Investigators described years of work compressed into months. Survivors spoke with restraint, their words measured and careful. The absence of spectacle did not diminish the impact. If anything, it intensified it. The facts spoke for themselves, heavy and unembellished. When sentencing arrived, the courtroom held a quiet tension. There was no expectation of leniency. The question was not whether Metheny would be held accountable, but how the system would articulate that accountability in the face of irreparable loss. The sentence imposed reflected the gravity of the crimes and the recognition that Metheny posed a permanent danger. It was definitive, removing any possibility of return to the streets. The decision carried a finality that words struggled to convey. Prison life did not alter Metheny in visible ways. He did not express remorse. He did not seek connection. He settled into incarceration with the same emotional flatness that had defined his life outside. Guards and officials noted his consistency. There were no dramatic incidents, no attempts to manipulate or perform. Within the prison environment, Metheny was not a legend. He was an inmate. The structure that had been absent in his life was now absolute. Yet even here, the absence of introspection persisted. Confinement did not produce insight. It produced routine. This phase of the story is marked not by resolution, but by containment. The system did what it could. It stopped further harm. But justice, in the deeper sense, remained incomplete. Lives could not be restored. Silence could not be undone as this chapter unfolds. The focus shifts from action to aftermath, from movement to stillness. Joe Metheny's world had narrowed to concrete walls and fixed schedules. The wider world, however, continued to reckon with what his story revealed. Prison did not confront Joe Metheny with himself in the way many imagine incarceration does. There was no visible reckoning, no unraveling, no dramatic shift from denial to reflection. Instead, confinement functioned as an extension of the emotional vacuum he had lived in for decades. The walls were solid, the routines fixed, and the expectations unambiguous. For someone who had long operated without inner restraint, External restraint was simply another condition to adapt to Metheny's daily life behind bars followed a strict rhythm. Wake-up calls, counts, meals, and limited movement defined time. The structure was absolute, leaving little room for improvisation. Yet this rigidity did not provoke resistance. If anything, it suited him. The prison environment removed uncertainty, replacing it with predictability. In a strange way, it mirrored the emotional flatness he had cultivated. Nothing required reflection, and nothing invited it. Interactions with other inmates were minimal. Metheny did not seek attention or dominance. He did not tell stories to establish reputation. He existed on the periphery, neither confrontational nor cooperative beyond necessity. Guards noted his compliance. He followed rules not out of respect, but indifference. Punishment held little meaning for someone who no longer attached emotional weight to experience. The absence of remorse remained consistent. Metheny did not speak of regret. He did not engage in programs aimed at rehabilitation or self-examination with any sincerity. When questioned, his responses were flat, procedural. The language of accountability did not resonate with him because the emotional framework required to support it was missing. For the families of victims, the sentencing brought a complex mix of relief and frustration. Relief that Metheny could no longer harm anyone. Frustration that so many answers would never come. Prison closed the door on future violence, but it also closed the door on full understanding. Silence lingered where clarity should have been. Public attention faded gradually, as it often does. Headlines gave way to news stories. The shock settled into memory. Metheny became a name associated with horror, then a case study, then a reference point in discussions about systemic failure and invisibility. The man himself receded into the background, absorbed by the institution meant to contain him. Within prison walls, time moved differently. Years passed without milestones. Metheny aged, his health deteriorating under the weight of long-term neglect and substance abuse. Yet, even decline did not prompt introspection. Physical deterioration did not translate into emotional insight. His inner world remained unchanged. What this phase of his life reveals is a sobering limitation of punishment. Incarceration can stop behavior, but it cannot restore what never fully developed. Metheny did not lose his humanity in prison. He had eroded it long before. The cell did not create emptiness. It merely contained it. As this chapter closes, the story reaches a kind of stillness. The violence has ended. The movement has stopped. What remains is aftermath, a landscape shaped by loss, unanswered questions, and the uncomfortable recognition that prevention failed where intervention came too late. Joe Metheny's life, now confined and narrowing, offers no redemption arc. There is no transformation to witness. There is only containment and time. And with that stillness comes the final question the story leaves behind. Not about one man, but about the systems that allowed him to exist unseen for so long. Chapter 15: Legacy of Fear and the Questions That Remain. When the immediate danger ended and Joe Metheny disappeared into the prison system, the city was left with something far more difficult than fear: reflection. The violence had stopped, but its imprint remained, not as a single shock, but as a lingering unease that seeped into conversations, policies, and memory. The story did not end with a sentence. It settled into the spaces between what was known and what would never be known. Baltimore's streets looked the same, but they did not feel the same. Places once dismissed as merely rough now carried an added weight. People revisited their own memories, moments when something felt wrong but passed without action. The legend of the meat truck, once half believed, now felt like a warning that had been ignored. Fear, in hindsight, seemed articulate. At the time, It had been indistinct. For communities already living on the margins, the aftermath was complicated. There was relief that the threat was gone, but also anger that it had existed for so long without intervention. The realization that invisibility had played such a central role in enabling violence forced a painful acknowledgement. Safety had not been distributed equally. Some lives had been easier to overlook. Families of victims faced an especially difficult reckoning. Closure, when it came, was partial. Some names were confirmed. Others remained uncertain. For many, there was no body to bury, no place to grieve publicly. The absence that had defined their loss continued, now accompanied by knowledge rather than mystery. Knowledge did not always bring peace. Public discourse shifted toward accountability. Questions emerged about policing, social services, and how missing persons cases are prioritized. Metheny's story became a reference point in conversations about systemic neglect, not because it was unique, but because it was extreme enough to expose patterns that often remain invisible. The media played its role, both illuminating and distorting. Coverage brought awareness, but also risked reducing complex lives to sensational headlines. Over time, the narrative began to narrow, focusing on Metheny as an anomaly rather than as a product of cumulative failure. This simplification was comforting, but incomplete. What lingered most strongly was a sense of proximity. People grappled with the fact that Metheny had lived openly among them. He was not hidden in isolation. He had occupied shared spaces. This proximity challenged assumptions about how evil looks and where it resides. The monster had not been disguised. It had been normalized as years passed. The case entered academic and professional discussions. Criminologists, social workers, and policymakers examined it for lessons. The focus shifted from fascination to prevention. How many warning signs can be ignored before silence becomes complicity? How many disappearances does it take for patterns to be seen? Metheny himself receded from relevance. He did not shape the legacy consciously. He did not attempt to control how he would be remembered. His indifference extended to the end. The legacy that formed around him did so despite his absence, shaped by those left behind. This chapter of the story is not about fear alone. It is about responsibility. It asks whether systems designed to protect can afford to overlook anyone. It asks whether indifference can be as dangerous as intent. And it asks what it means to truly see the people who move through the margins of society. The questions do not have simple answers. They resist closure. They persist quietly, like the streets that once absorbed too much silence. And as the story moves toward its end, what remains is not a lesson neatly learned, but a warning still unfolding. One that challenges us to listen more closely, look more carefully, and refuse the comfort of disbelief when fear speaks softly. Time has a way of smoothing the sharpest edges of horror, but it does not erase the imprint it leaves behind. As the years passed after Joe Metheny's crimes were exposed, the immediate shock faded, replaced by something quieter and more complex. Memory settled into layers, facts, emotions, lessons, and unresolved discomfort. The city moved forward, but it did not move on unchanged. For many, the most unsettling aspect of Metheny's legacy was not the brutality itself, but the duration of silence that surrounded it. His crimes forced a collective reckoning with how easily violence can hide when it targets those already pushed to the edges. The realization lingered that danger had not been invisible. It had been inconvenient to see in the aftermath. Some changes followed. Conversations around missing persons gained urgency. Advocacy groups pressed harder for equal attention to cases involving sex workers, the unhoused, and people struggling with addiction. Progress was uneven, often slow, but the language shifted. The idea that certain lives were less searchable became harder to defend openly. Still, discomfort remained. Metheny's story resisted clean conclusions. There was no single reform that could be credited with preventing a repeat. No policy could guarantee that silence would never again shelter violence. What remained instead was awareness, fragile, imperfect, but necessary. The legend of the meat truck, once a whisper, transformed into a cautionary tale. Not as folklore, but as evidence that intuition often speaks before proof exists. People reflected on the difference between fear dismissed and fear investigated. The gap between those responses became a focal point for broader conversations about trust, credibility, and whose voices are believed. Families continued to live with ambiguity. Anniversaries passed without ceremony. Questions lingered without answers. For them, legacy was not abstract. It was daily. It existed in empty chairs, unanswered phones, and memories interrupted. The world's attention moved on faster than grief ever could. Joe Metheny himself faded into institutional obscurity. His death in custody closed the final chapter of his life, but it did not resolve the story he left behind. There were no final revelations, no apologies, no moments of clarity. His absence did not bring relief so much as finality. What he represented remained in academic circles. The case became a reference point, a study in how extreme violence can persist without spectacle. Analysts emphasized the role of systemic blind spots, of fragmented data, of social hierarchies that quietly determine urgency. Metheny was no longer just an individual. He was an example of what happens when erosion goes unnoticed. Yet there was also resistance to turning the story into abstraction. Advocates argued that analysis must not replace remembrance. The victims were not symbols. They were people with names, histories, and futures interrupted. Preserving that truth became part of the legacy too. As this story reaches its end, it does not offer comfort. It offers clarity of a different kind. It shows how danger can live among us without disguise, how silence can function as permission, and how attention, when withheld, can be lethal. The questions that remain are not rhetorical. They ask how communities decide what matters, how systems prioritize urgency, and how easily disbelief can override instinct. They ask whether prevention requires more than resources, whether it requires humility, listening, and the willingness to take fear seriously before it becomes fact. Joe Metheny's legacy is not defined by his name or his actions alone. It is defined by the space that surrounded him, the gaps in care, the delays in recognition, the voices unheard. It is a reminder that the absence of noise does not equal the absence of harm. And as the final silence settles, the story leaves behind a responsibility rather than a resolution. To look more closely, to listen more carefully, and to understand that the most dangerous threats are often the ones we are taught not to see.